We've been in-ground, underground, multi-ground, overground. Now we finally end up with ground. Unfortunately, one of our speakers isn't with us, Nazia Khan. I think she is stranded in Pakistan at the moment, doing field work, and so couldn't be with us. So we just have two speakers for the final panel. First of all, Beth Cullen, and secondly, Labib Hossain, who is here with us from Cornell University on the east coast of America. Just very quickly, Beth, as I think most people here know, is a research fellow with Monsoon Assemblages. She's an anthropologist whose work focuses on human environmental relations using ethnographic and participatory techniques. Labib is a PhD student in the history of architecture and urban development at Cornell University, and his research is focused on the traditional practices in monsoon landscapes that offer alternative readings of human habitation. So straight after Beth, if Labib will begin. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lindsay. So I'm just presenting some work in progress, actually, and it's based on field work that I did in Bangladesh with Christina last summer. So I'm going to speak quite briefly, and then I'm going to show a short film. So Bangladesh is frequently cited as one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. A recent World Bank report has estimated that Bangladesh will need up to 5.7 billion by 2050 to safeguard key infrastructure such as roads, railways and river embankments against extreme weather events. Such notions of proofing against climate are becoming increasingly commonplace, but as Marcus Taylor argues, this perpetuates a deeply embedded dichotomy that society and climate are separate, bounded domains. Climate is presented as something external that humans have to adapt to. But how can you proof against something that's entangled within social worlds and inseparable from life itself? I'm taking the brick, the building block of human habitation, as a starting point to demonstrate that weather and climate are embedded within even the most ostensibly human-made of things. And this work, as I've said, is based on fieldwork observations of brick making in Bangladesh, a landscape within which the monsoon is deeply enmeshed. So following the life cycle of the brick from sediment to clay, from clay to brick, and from brick to ground, illuminates monsoonal rhythms, forces, relations and movements, and complex entanglements of human and more than human energies. So I'm using rhythm as a lens to explore these temporal entanglements. The recurrent rhythmic nature of the monsoon distinguishes it from other seemingly chaotic weather events, indicating that rhythm and temporality are important aspects of monsoonal agency. Its dynamic yet recurring patterns create distinct temporal structures which greatly influence human and non-human life. Paying attention to these non-human rhythms, tempos and durations is essential if we're to take the agencies and liveliness of non-human processes seriously. Acknowledging the ways in which non-human rhythms are entangled within human rhythms may also provide a way of challenging perceived dichotomies between society and meteorological forces. So to understand the significance of the brick in Bangladesh and its life cycle in this particular context, it's necessary to understand something about the nature of the landscape. So much of the country consists of flat, low-lying alluvial plains. And the combination of three immense interconnected river systems and heavy monsoon rainfall has created a dynamic aqueous region characterized by huge fluctuations in wetness throughout the annual cycle. From November to March, only 7% of the land is covered in water. From June to September, waters swell to cover almost half of the country. This is a hybrid, shifting environment where land and water are in constant flux. Social activities respond to these fluctuations, with the intensities and types of work changing with the periodic transformations of the environment. And these patterns are not just an agricultural phenomenon, but influence urban contexts too. The rhythms of the monsoon are embedded within the very building blocks of Bangladesh's cities and the infrastructures on which they depend. So from sediment to clay. Land in delta is formed through the gradual sedimentation of alluvial soil deposited by flowing rivers. And in the context of the Bengal Delta, sedimentation is part of an immense geological cycle. Mountains eroded by monsoon rains are transformed into sediment. Sediment is transported in vast quantities to the delta, and the weight of the delta contributes to the emergence of mountains. As geologists have said, mountains owe their metamorphic muscles to the drumbeat of tiny raindrops. In Bangladesh, these processes of sedimentation and soil formation are driven by the monsoon, whose flows sculpt the terrain. And monsoon flows can reach up to 100 times that of non-monsoon flows, the force of which enables rivers to transport tons of sediment. So with each monsoon season, a soft layer of sediment is deposited, forming exceptionally rich, nutrient-rich soil. And these fluctuating intensities of flow, intersected by periods of settling, form part of a cyclical turning of ground. So the alluvial clay soils that emerge from these processes form the perfect raw material for bricks. Clay lends viscosity and plasticity to the soil, which creates concretion when it's baked or burned. However, removal of topsoil for brick making is occurring at a speed which cannot compete with geological cycles. Rapid urbanisation and growing demand for brick is contributing to soil loss as farmers sell their clay-rich soil to the brick kilns. The brick sector in Bangladesh consumes an estimated 45 million tonnes of clay every year. And despite the vast amounts of sediment that are deposited in the Bengal Delta, it may take up to 20 years for topsoil to accumulate again, depending on the location of the land. So mining of soil establishes vicious cycles of excavation. Removal of soil from one area of land changes the local topography, forcing others to do the same. And as construction increases, so demand for soil increases. So from clay to brick. Brick making operates around a monsoonal cycle, beginning in the dry season and ending when the first monsoon rains arrive. Brick fields churn relentlessly in these drier months, transforming the landscape. Plumes of black smoke, blankets of thick smog, and clouds of brick dust contribute to atmospheric pollution, which alters rainfall patterns during the wet season. During this period, clay is mined, weathered, and prepared. Bricks are made by hand, sun-dried, fired, and then cooled. Bricks are formed through heavy, repetitive work, coming into being through the respirations, pulses, and circulations of the bodies that make them. Each task creates its own temporal pattern and embodied interaction, and each brick field is a complex choreography between bodies and materials, within which multiple rhythms are produced and interweave. These include the rhythms of seasonal migrants on whose labour the brick fields depend. But the brick kilns cannot operate during the wet season. Moisture affects the drying and firing of bricks, and monsoon waters cover the brick fields, which are often situated on low-lying land next to riverbanks. Bricks fired during the dry season are transported often to urban centres during the wet season. Swollen rivers enable the smooth transportation of heavily laden boats. Boats are also hired to carry soil and coal during the rains at a much lower cost than land transportation. And the seasonal fluctuation of riverbanks alters distances that bricks have to be carried, influencing labour costs and the quantities of food eaten by those who carry the bricks, from kilns to boats and boats to shore. The price of brick also increases during monsoon months as brick fields splutter to a stop, reducing supply and stalling construction. The waters slowly start receding in the month of October, and the brick-making cycle can begin again. So from brick to road. Within this alluvial terrain, boulders, gravel and stone are in short supply. Fired clay bricks offer an alternative construction material and are used for infrastructure as well as for buildings. Crushed bricks are used as fill material and form a base layer for nearly all paved roads in the country, with whole bricks being used to surface roads and stabilise their embankments. Roads are typically constructed on top of embankments in order to raise them above wet season flood levels. Overfired bricks that have been subject to intensities of heating are used as aggregate to elevate roads and protect them against intensities of wetness. So the creation of raised roads is an attempt to separate dry from wet, paving the way for development and enabling expansion into the delta. So the formation of earthen mounds has a long history in Bangladesh as a mode of habitation in a monsoonal terrain. But road infrastructure enabled by the brick and also partly by bitumen impose inflexible linear forms into a fluid landscape. Although roads create new geographies and lines of relation, as well as speeds and rhythms of movement, they also disrupt existing patterns. The presence of embanked roads often exacerbates flooding as they hinder the flow of water and the deposition of sediment. So, weathering by monsoon rains means that these roads require constant maintenance. Fluctuations of wetness, erosion of underlying soft clay soils, and cracking of hard surfaces create seasonal rhythms of repair. Their frequent collapse leads to the monsoon being perceived as a threat and creates a never-ending demand for brick. So through their weathering and disintegration, brick returns to ground, completing the cycle. So embedded within each brick are multiple rhythms, cycles, and scales of time. And in the words of architect Gregory Palermo, each brick entails earth, sky, weathering, and temporality. So despite their seemingly static form, bricks are in fact vibrant polyrhythmic assemblages, which come into being through entanglements of human energies, geological processes, and meteorological forces. Following the temporality and materiality of the brick illustrates the multiplicity of ways in which the monsoon is enmeshed within lived environments. The monsoon is not separate from or external to human life. It's constitutive of and entangled within social worlds. So I'm gonna stop there in terms of the speaking and show you just a short film that I've put together based on footage that both me and Christina recorded in Bangladesh. And I'm using it hopefully as a way of representing the rhythms and cycles of the brick sort of through this film. And hopefully it captures elements of this journey from clay to brick, from brick to ground, and also the rhythms of the work at different stages of the process.
Thank you, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say thanks to Professor Bremner for accepting my abstract at the very last moment, and also the other members of Monsoon Assemblages for organizing this wonderful symposium. I have enjoyed all the presentation as well as the projects that are hung on the wall. So my paper is about a critical reading of the dry and permanent ground through the practice of muslin weaving in Bengal. I think it will connect what Beth just showed, because I will also talk about materiality, and I will focus on the same region. Muslin is a kind of cotton fabric which is delicate and very transparent in nature that once attracted the entire world. The fabric once called as Bangla Kapor, Dhakai or Gangetiki, more commonly known as muslin. So my presentation will be in 4 parts. In the first part of my presentation, I will discuss about the colonial reading of muslin weaving process through different historical references. In contrast with this model, in the second part, I will talk about the non-linear reading or the craft model of the practice that begins with the question of why the practice was unique to Bengal and followed by a series of drawing investigations. In contrasting this craft model and the colonial linear model, I will show that weaver's landscape is more transient, dynamic, shifting, wet, unsettling, whereas the colonial landscape is stable, permanent, dry, and rooted. I will also address different colonial interventions on landscape and the muslin practice in colonial setting with industrial revolution as an active backdrop. So these discussions endanger several other questions and directions, like what was the role of the landscape of this region? Was there a connection between the practice of muslin weaving and human habitation? So these will be discussed in the last part of the presentation. So the first part is about the colonial reading of muslin or the linear model. First of all, I just want to mention, to note here, muslin is a very old practice. The earliest reference can be found in Rig Veda, which is from 15th century BC. It was also mentioned in Megasthenesis Indica or in Ptolemy's Geographia, also mentioned by different historical accounts of different travelers, for example, Ibn Battuta, Fahian, or Marco Polo. French, Portuguese, and Dutch were involved in muslin trade until 17th and late 18th century, but following the intervention of East India Company, the British finally established colonial power in the subcontinent in 1757. From then, they were in the leading role on muslin trade for the next century. In explaining the colonial reading of muslin weaving, I will refer the book titled A Descriptive and Historical Accounts of the Cotton Manufacture of Dhaka, which was one of the earliest accounts on the history of Dhaka's muslin. This book was published during the time of the Great Exhibition 1851 in Crystal Palace, London, where muslin was exhibited. There were few etchings of the making process that were published in that book. These are probably among the earliest published drawings on the making of muslin in Dhaka or in Bengal. This book also contains a descriptive account of the different steps during its making process. The book, A Descriptive and Historical Account of Cotton Manufacture of Dhaka, started with the opinions of the press on muslins of Dhaka being exhibited at the Great Exhibition held in Crystal Palace. But I will not go into these details, but I highlighted some keywords which are like delicate, beautiful, elegant, and these terms repeatedly appeared in different colonial texts. It is almost similar to the concept of mimicry as theorized by Homi Bhabha. But here it is evident the visible and objective description of muslin as a product where the eye is privileged. With the imperial gaze, the product has been described, imported, and celebrated in other parts of the world. These are some representation of Dhaka weavers. So the book detailed out the total making process starting from the cotton plant. After the harvest in April, May, the carpus was collected and then combed, rolled and teased. The separated cotton was then preserved inside a skin of fish. After the preparation of the cotton, the rest of the process is divided in two parts, mainly spinning and weaving. During the spinning process, young females spun the finest thread early in the morning or at late afternoon. The weaving part consisted of several steps, like warping, reed to warp, and warp to loom, and finally working with the loom. Male members of the family were involved in most of the weaving steps. The book contains images of each steps along detailed description. So following the detailed description of the making process and the drawings from the book, this drawing shows a linear reading of muslin weaving process starting from the plant to the fabric. Next, I will talk about the non-linear reading of muslin, or the craft model. So while the transparency of muslin was celebrated all over the world, its making in Bengal, starting with the plant through the complex steps involving the engagement of the body and the use of local materials, embodied the singular landscape of a particular place. Answering the question why a certain location of Bengal, precisely 12 miles south of present Dhaka city, along the Meghna river. So this is the region I'm talking about. I mean, only in these regions the finest cotton were produced, and the muslin practice was there. So I'll talk about why this particular location. I'll talk about three possible reasons. First, the plant, the atmosphere, and the engagement of the human body. The plant, Futicarpus, which is actually produced the cotton used for finest or thinnest muslin, thrived only along the Meghna. It was a particular species that was dependent not only on seasonal inundation, but on a number of other factors, including the proximity to the sea, the rate of temperature change between warmer river water and colder sea water, and the chemical composition of the sediments deposited during the seasonal inundations. The harvest time of the cotton plant is April-May, and the making process started from June to September, which is the monsoon time. And the total making process, spinning and weaving, was highly dependent on this monsoon-fed landscape. This image, the circle, shows the location of Dhaka city. It's a plan from 15th century by a Portuguese cartographer. But this image shows Dhaka, I mean, during that time, it was very close to the sea. And the regions of south of the Dhaka city, it is the part of the active delta. So the lot of land accumulated after, in last 500 years. So during the spinning process, the finest thread was spun in intensely humid conditions, usually in the early morning and evening, and by young women with water bowls around them to moisten the air, or else beside inundated areas or on boats. It is said that if there was not much humidity, they transferred the charka and the other instruments to a large boat to ensure that the thread was kept moist by the ambient humidity. As the process was done entirely by hands, it required high precision to maintain the precise thinness of the thread. Without sufficient humidity, the thread could be easily damaged. To note here, it required months to make a piece of muslin cloth, and they spent months on boats to continue the process. So, in other words, wetness in atmosphere, or the moisture in the water that was present in the air, was one of the reasons for the unique muslin practice in Bengal. Interestingly, this is evident in the naming of different types of muslin, like Abrawan, which is a type of muslin which means flowing water, Shabnam, which means evening dew, Samandar Lahir, waves of the sea, Jamdani, which means floating flower, and so on. And they all capture different forms of wet conditions. So there are several sequences in the weaving parts that were mostly done in outdoor areas, and these processes were also highly dependent on monsoon atmosphere. And the forest that I think Harshvardhan was showing in his presentation, the forest that holds air and water, or in other words, the humid air, which was also a major requirement in this weaving process. So in third part, I'll talk about transparency and humidity. So here, transparency acknowledges the object, which is described in the linear model, but humidity connects it with the landscape and with its all complex relationship. The colonial reductive model mentioned above compromised this landscape dimension necessary for the making of the cloth. And in contrast with the linear model, in the craft model, different other layers like time and seasonal requirements, materiality, sensory and spatial features that are explained above, juxtapose on the linear drawing to explore complexities of the practice on this monsoon fade landscape. This is the latest drawing that I made. So this non-linearity works against the linear logic of colonial reductive model and of colonial rationality. While linearity connected with the industrial development, the non-linear approach or the craft model denotes the disorderly beauty of the weaving process and the monsoon landscape of Bengal. The disorderliness is associated with the dimension of landscape, time, its figures, and interrelationship between them. The disruption of the linearity contradicts the oppressive qualities of concrete reasoning and the logic of domination. However, as Amitav Ghosh mentioned in his novel The Circle of Reason, this complex non-linear model or fractal kind of reason was vulnerable under the colonial domination. And it is no wonder that muslin weaving experienced its tragic end through the death of the very cotton plant species during the colonial period. So after industrial revolution in England, the traditional weaving practice was replaced by this factory-like setting. As you can see in this image, the local women preparing the raw material in a production line setup, mainly to support the industries in England. I will just touch upon very quickly different other forms of colonial interventions on the monsoon ground of Bengal. And this is one of the many drawings by James Rennell, who was appointed by the English company. He was the company surveyor to draw all the rivers of Bengal, an attempt to fix the landscape and separate land from water. As the company took the control of collecting land revenue, the dynamics of the monsoon landscape was a big hindrance. The landscape of shifting rivers was complicated and incomprehensible. The colonizers wanted to see the land permanent and the dynamic and shifting rivers in need of control to keep them in a fixed place. Rennell spent over a decade to draw these lines of rivers following the conventional trigonometric method, but it was clearly evident in many of his accounts the limitation of such methods and the impossibility of such tasks. I'm referring his journal that is available. I think online it is available. They also had to adapt elaborate system of laws and regulations to govern such landscape. But again, there are so many complaints and disputes over the ownership of these transient grounds. And I'm referring many court cases in the late 18th and also from 19th century that reflects the limitation of such laws and the repetitive colonial attempts to exert control and authority. Coming back to the story of muslin practice, this image, it's a painting by Charles E. Oily in 1823. During that time, weavers were forced to do indigo cultivation. And also you can see in this image the hut and also the loom, which is in a ruined state. And also weavers lost their jobs and the country was hit by many famines during that time. So coming back to the story of this fabric, it took a dramatic twist as this practice of manufacturing it was seized and the extinction of the cotton plant species occurred about 200 years ago during this period. In the history books, it is not hard to find different administrative operations, for example, like imposing tax or forcing weavers to do other jobs, as the reason behind the decline of muslin practice, but there could be another plausible reason, which is like fixing the landscape, framing or controlling the rivers for the sake of permanent land resulted in the ecological transformations that literally affected the valuable species Phytocarpus as well as the muslin practice in Bengal. Looking at certain traditional practices like muslin weaving in monsoon landscape can offer an alternative reading of human habitation, one that challenges the dry and permanent ground. Spinners spent months on boats to make the thinnest threads and continue the process. I mean, this image is interesting to me because you can see a close resemblance between the hut and the boat. And I mean, after the discussion on weaving, can we say, like, is it possible that this practice is a mode of habitation? Can it be said that the boat was an integral component of dwelling, given that people of this part of Bengal spent months on them searching for extra humidity? Perhaps boats were not a mere part of dwelling or floating extension of farm ground. Rather, boats together with the farm ground, if there was any, were a part in the milieu of wetness. In this monsoon landscape where much is submerged during the rain, when the lines of riverbanks are erased, when towns established by the colonizers are washed away by the changing course of rivers, what is the point of reference? Does this open up a new imagination that shifts us from a divided landscape to a ground of wetness, a ground that requires a new vocabulary of habitation? Thank you.
What a fantastic way to end the conference, with kind of coming right round to the human body and human rhythms and their entanglement in daily and seasonal cycles. We've moved from the cosmological to the absolutely material and physical. I think it's wonderful sequence. So, I don't want to say too much more, except to say that from Beth's presentation, Tim and I were just whispering to each other, just this idea of endurance and duration. You know, those bricks are hard work to make at every single step of the way. And then your reference to this incredibly fine scale weaving, which must also have been extraordinarily taxing on the human body. Perhaps if you could just talk to that a little bit.
I think that was one of the things that was most, I mean, I found it really shocking actually, just witnessing after going to the brick kilns and kind of seeing the immense amount of kind of effort and energy that went into the brick making process, and suddenly stumbling across them being broken in that way. But then I think that's what's interesting about thinking about where the brick comes from, also in terms of that duration of kind of geological time that's kind of also producing the material that they then emerge from. And just thinking in terms of those differences in time and temporal cycles, is interesting.
Thank you for the question. So last summer I visited one of the weavers' village in Bengal. I mean, Muslin is not there, but a similar kind of practice is still there, and it's called like Jamdani weaving. But I mean, they exactly follow the similar process, but now the cotton is coming from somewhere else. It's exported cotton, so they don't need anymore these wet conditions, and also it is not there. The forest is not there. The water bodies are not there. But they're following a similar kind of process, which is by hand. And so I mean, it was incredible to see like the passion and the time that involved in this process, the idea of temporality that is attached with the process. And I mean, it took them like, I found references where it mentioned like to weave a muslin white sari, which is the cloth of women, for women in that part, and it took almost like 6 to 7 months just to weave a sari. So it's like one single sari. So it's like a very time-consuming process, but it also at the same time a meditation. So I feel like it's really interesting, this idea of temporality in this weaving process.
Okay, any questions? Anthony?
Thank you for those both wonderful presentations and for that incredible film, which was just jaw-dropping. The question is also about duration and endurance. And Beth, I think you said something along the lines of when these bricks form these hard edges in a fluid landscape, and it also it struck me looking at those images of construction that thinking as a kind of architecty person who's used to designing a pavement, that we'd probably call that a very flexible pavement. We wouldn't call that something that was inflexible or hard. That would be like something actually very soft and moving. And then looking at other parts of your film which showed these bricks being broken down or falling off the edges or kind of sinking back in. And I just wondered, thinking of also of bricks as materials which are porous and which particularly in assembly become very, very sort of squishy. If you could say a bit more about the flexibility versus inflexibility, and maybe that last part of the loop you were describing when they sort of sink back in.
Yeah, just a brief question for Beth. Arriving in London early this week, I was just sort of reminded of how much brick there is and how everything is red and white. And I'm wondering if, and I'm also sort of in the process of transitioning out of fieldwork, and I'm just wondering how that felt for you post fieldwork, and whether returning to London and seeing all of this brick everywhere had some sort of meaning.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Yeah, it's interesting kind of thinking with the brick in terms of flexibility and inflexibility, because I'm aware that in some ways there is, I mean, in terms of the porosity and the kind of the way that they're used in those kind of paved roads, in this, when you start to see kind of concrete surfaces with no space for water, it can seem to, in one respect, to be something that is quite flexible. But I suppose what I was really struck by in Bangladesh was, I mean, traveling through the rivers and kind of looking, and really, I mean, at one point we were kind of walking in bare feet on this kind of squishy ground. And when you kind of compare that feeling underfoot with the brick, there's these kind of degrees of hardness and softness that are very contextual, I think. And I think it's the extent of those lines in the landscape. And I suppose that combination of kind of roads on embankments that become these quite hard lines in a landscape where there isn't really hard lines. And that's what I'm thinking with, I suppose. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it is very contextual, you know, how you kind of think about hardness and softness and materiality. Yeah. And then for Matt, fieldwork, I mean, I've done, as an anthropologist, very long periods of fieldwork. So for my PhD fieldwork, I did kind of 16 months of living in the Rift Valley in a grass hut with nomadic pastoralists, and know how long fieldwork feels. These fieldwork trips are very short, kind of intense bursts, and are very, very different to those kind of longer fieldwork periods. I suppose they also have their own challenges, and I do find that thing of kind of moving back and forth between worlds quite disorienting, and I mean, it's so immersive, and you can see, I mean, you sort of observe and experience so much, and then when you come back, it's a process of kind of working through and trying to make sense of things, and that is very personal, and yeah, it's an emotional process too, I think.
I guess I was wondering if the amount of bricks in London was like helped or didn't help with that process. Or?
Yeah, I mean, I do see bricks everywhere, and now at the moment, and I suppose because when you start thinking about something, there's that tendency to see them wherever you look. But one of the things that I've been really struck by when we've been, both particularly in Chennai, when we were working in Chennai, these kind of huge colonial red brick buildings where the red is kind of intensified, it's painted in this very particular red. And then coming back here and kind of looking at traces of Bangladesh here and being constantly reminded of these interconnections between places. And it's personal for me too. I mean, I don't know, I feel it. So, yeah, I don't know if that goes any way towards responding to your question, but thanks.
Yeah, thanks again for two wonderful presentations. Quick question to Labib. I was thinking about the thread and the political movement that has obviously had a history in the subcontinent, and I obviously have no understanding or background of Muslin whatsoever, but I was just wondering if there seems to be a story or tapestry of knowledges between different kinds of threads. Is this a thread that is articulated by particular communities? Is this a thread that comes out of a particular kind of political form? Obviously, you have engaged with that, but I was just wondering whether some of these fantasies of threads. I'm thinking about cotton here, obviously, and silk that have had very powerful histories, and so I was just wondering if this, if the thread you're talking about shares political energy with those other threads.
Definitely, there are a lot of things that I did not mention during my presentation, but I think Amitav Ghosh in his novels mentioned a lot of things about like this connection between this weaving practice and how it is connected, how it is kind of connected the entire world. For example, I think, if I remember, he mentioned at some point like, sorry, I forgot the exact references, but I mean, also during the old times, I'm talking about like, I'm referring Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, or like in Aryan's descriptions, he mentioned like how this lot of muslin fabric were exported from Bengal to Roman Empire, and there was some accounts of Pliny, who mentioned that Roman Empire is losing all its gold because of buying these clothes, which is mainly used by the elite women for fashion purpose, and they're losing this wealth. And also definitely, it is definitely connected with the colonialism as well. I mean, all the different, colonialism started with trading and this trading purpose, and French and Portuguese and these old colonies came to this part mainly like cotton trading was one of them, and also like tea was one other major commodities. So it is very much intricately connected with this all trading purposes, and definitely with this trading routes, it connects a lot of other places and a lot of other regions.
Hi, and it's more common for Beth, really. The video is really fantastic because it shows how different clay and brick are, and it reminded me of Louis Kahn, who designed the parliament in Bangladesh, I think, in brick. And he said something about the brick wants to be an arch. And there was a kind of parallel with what you were saying about the brick wants to be a straight road. But I was also questioning, and I don't have any particular answer to this, but what does the clay want to be if the brick wants to be an arch or a straight road?
No, I mean, this is something that Christina actually referred to. We went to the Louis Kahn Parliament building while we were there, and Christina spoke about that kind of, what does the brick want to be? I don't know whether the brick wants to be a straight road. It's a question for me. I've kind of been musing about this. It gets turned into that, but I don't know whether that's what it wants to be. It's an interesting kind of. I don't know whether the clay wants to be a brick either. I don't know. I'm kind of thinking about these things as I'm working with the material, but I don't have any answers. It's still very much kind of percolating, I think, at the moment.
Hi.
We'll just have one last question, and then we'll go to the summing up.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you both for such interesting talks. What I was really interested in was the human practice and the context that the practice took place. So, for example, Labib, you talked about the proximity to the sea, and you know, this exploitation of the water, the soil, the air, because the air had to be a certain type of, you know, air with moisture. And then similarly, Beth, you also talked about the low-lying flat land and proximity to the river and the connection to the type of soil that's needed for the brick. It's not a question, but I just find, and then if we go back to the historical, really interesting historical maps that were shown in Labib's talk, and it showed how Dhaka has changed. The proximity to the sea has changed because more land has been pushed towards the country. So the practice has changed, the human practice. So I just find the connection of the practice, human practice, exploitation of the nature, really interesting in both of your talks. I just wonder if you see that moving, changing in any way, because you also mentioned about the 25 years it would take to replace the soil of, you know, making so many bricks because of the rapid urbanization in Dhaka. So I just thought if you had any comments on that.
I think that, I mean, that's one of the things that I was trying to get my head around in terms of the location of the brick kilns, because when we were first visiting these kind of, we were around Dhaka, where there's so many brick kilns kind of all along the riverbank, and I automatically assumed that they were located there because of the soil, and because of the kind of clay, you know, that it's easy to get this kind of clay-rich soil from next to the riverbanks. But then realised that quite quickly the areas around the brick kilns run out of that raw material quite quickly because of the rate and the amount of bricks that they're producing. And then realised through kind of talking to people that farmers are selling their soil because they can't get enough from their immediate proximity. So there's this quite an interesting kind of relationship, and I haven't fully got my head around how far that goes in terms of, you know, where the soil is kind of being mined from, transported to. So I think there's a whole kind of spatial component to that relationship that I haven't managed to get enough information about yet. And I think partly because we are only in those places for quite short spaces of time. And so it's quite a cursory kind of dive into some of these dynamics, and I'd love to explore them more.
Yeah, talking about human practice, I mean, what I have found in this muslin weaving practice is that there was a very conscious use of these different atmospheric conditions, and used it to make this, to continue this practice and make this fabric. I think there is a kind of tendency to like attach the idea of spirituality or this kind of mythical things to the practice. I mean, I've seen some historical accounts where it says like the muslin is weaved by the mermaids, or it's like woven underwater. But I think it's because, the reason is there. I think one historian mentioned that it is because like when the passing travelers were passing a region and they could hear the singing of the spinners, but they couldn't see them because it's a mystic, the misty weather. And because of the fog, they couldn't see them, and they kind of brought back the stories of muslin being made by the mermaids. So it's like, I think it's, in every possible and every steps of this muslin weaving process, you will find there is a kind of reason, there is a kind of scientific environmentality, I would say, and it's not just a kind of myth, and we need to demystify this kind of conceptions. And also at the same time, the dynamics of the landscape. And I found your presentation, yesterday's presentation, very well, very fascinating, because at some point you mentioned that sediment as an archive. And, but at the same time, like these shore landscapes, like these are constantly changing and shifting and even disappearing. And I think there is a law which says that if the land is there for 20 years, then it is legally considered as land. Otherwise, what is it? Non-land, or what is it? So it's a kind of these gray areas, and it's a kind of problematic area in our modern conception of different thoughts. But if we look at these different practices, local practices, we will find that how this local people kind of made conscious use of these different atmospheric conditions, this transient character of the atmosphere. And also part of my project is to think more about the idea of dwelling that is not rooted, that is not firm, that's not stable, but a more kind of in between detachedness and rootedness. So yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. I think we'll close now. And David, do you want to come up to the front immediately? Thank you.
Thanks. Shall I use this or? Thank you. So we've had a pretty amazing day and a half. Loads of great papers, 6 panels, a keynote, some great discussions. There's no way that I can sort of sum up or conclude sort of the rich engagements that we've had. But even though Lindsay didn't introduce me, I'm from the politics department though, so I'm not really like as architecturally. And I was just thinking that of the 3 symposiums that we've had, this was possibly the most political, and that there was something very political about ground and destabilizing ground. And in a few of our discussions, we've sort of touched on that. What is it that's going on? And so I guess I wanted to just raise 2 themes in the continuation of the discussion. One about violence and the other about silence, I guess. And I think that the sort of the elephant in the room, or the what's going on with ground that makes it so political. And I guess just in a common sense way, there's the figure and ground in a traditional binary. And the figure is normally the traditional or modernist subject. And so we're sort of thinking, I think a lot of the work that we've been doing and the implicit nature of our politics is that the modernist subject doesn't exist without ground in a volume, strata, fixed and solid way. However, there hasn't been a lot of discussion of the figure. And the other grounds that we've talked about, we had loads of grounds. We had multiple grounds, a bit like the Wombles. We've had underground, overground, underground, in-ground, with ground. So what is the other to the other grounds? It's like the on-ground. That's where the subject lives, like on ground. And the only on in relation to ground was with the keynote, where what on earth is the ground? So I'm just thinking, it's interesting, the politics that works in an implicit way. And what are the consequences of those? Politics, I don't know, politics has consequences in different ways. In terms of the violence aspect, which is one way into thinking about the politics of grounds and the absence of figures, I think it's sort of clear that there is a sort of violence that we might think about when we focus on grounds, and that's the violence of extractivism, or as Tim Ingold was saying, the violence of stratigraphy, the idea that grounds are just there and that we can sort of rent them and use them and exploit them. And that sort of violence is, I think, is sort of at the fore in quite a few of the presentations that we had. A sort of settler colonial violence, we would say now. In the past, maybe a capitalist-y type of violence. And it's not only a violence on the ground or against the ground, it's also a violence that's grounded on a certain understanding of ground that enables a modernist subject to act in those ways. And we don't like that violence. But there's another type of violence as well, which we seem to sort of accept in a better way. And that's obviously the revenge of the ground, the revenge against modernist, extractivist stratigraphy, the violence of the earth, the rebellion of the soils, the turning away of those grounds that modernity has been so abusive towards. And we might see that as celebratory violence. Often when we seem to be listening to presentations or watching things on the news, it's like, yeah, finally, sticking it to the man. You know, this is the revenge. This is what modernity's been waiting for. There's that sort of feel-good factor about this sort of, not quite emancipatory, but finally, it's about time. And this sort of violence is sort of also educational, of course. That's why we like to talk about it and to watch it, because we learn from that violence, of course, that, yeah, we were wrong. Yes, of course, things are interrelated. Yes, of course, grounds can't be like that. And it's not just educational. There's a certain justice, of course, as well. And I don't know, I'm not like a big pacifist or anything, but there seems to be something wrong with this good violence versus the bad violence, because, of course, the good violence is perpetrated on people. Well, on people and also on other non-human others as well. And it seems to me quite often that we can sort of naturalize that sort of other violence, the return of the repressed, and not see it in quite the same social, political, and philosophical, and maybe negative ways in which we might have appreciated it before. And we might also respond differently. We might respond when we see sort of, I don't know, we might call it extreme weather or something like that, but it has like huge catastrophic effects on people's lives. We might respond by thinking, yeah, we really need to like consume less and think more about recycling. And in the meantime, the real violence of the world sort of continues. And I just sort of worry when we politicized grounds in these ways, and we sort of take the emphasis off figures and subjects and the mediation of sort of collective social political processes, that violence becomes sort of bifurcated and treated in, as I'm saying, ways which we might want to reconsider, maybe. Not necessarily. It's not a critique, it's just that these things seem to be there. Anyway, but on a more positive note, maybe or maybe not, I was also thinking about the silences. And I think it's great to be writing letters to the soil and to be spending time thinking about what bricks want when they, or clay. But there seems to be a sort of, in our effort to give voice to the ground, to like recover and to recoup some of the sort of absences of modernity and the ways that things have been marginalized, that there's also a politics to those things. And I think, as someone was saying, that these are sort of choices, that every form of representation or thinking involves certain choices. We can't necessarily listen to all the voices at the same time. And I sort of worry about the silences that occur when we imagine ourselves as embedded and relationally bringing the ground towards us, that we might sort of forget the inevitable hierarchical centrality of the subject, particularly the academic and researching subjects. And which is what I was thinking about in terms of the letter writing, as opposed to the sort of practices. But I also worry about that in terms of our cartographical representations, that it seems that we have either a perspective from nowhere, where we're sort of revisioning, doing science, being speculative or imaginary, or we have a view from inside, where we're like trying to draw out and listen to the soil or the creatures. But we seem to be losing ourselves in that, I think, sometimes. And it's like something's refreshing about that, but it also makes our discussions about the politics of what's at stake in what we're doing more difficult, because it sort of appears as if we don't really exist. That in focusing on the ground, obviously, we write out the figure, we write out the subject from our research processes. And if the subject does appear, normally it's just like representing something else, like a cipher for the soil or the earth or the stratospheric fields. And so I worry about that as well, the violences and the silences. I'm not saying I have any big solutions to these things, because that's politics. It wouldn't be politics if it was just like solvable. But just from my slightly outsidery perspective, I was just thinking of those things. So that's not it, because Lindsay's going to say something.
I'm just going to. Thank you. You're done. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Fantastic. Well, I knew if I asked David to close, he'd open. You know, he'll open up the discussions to kind of open up the questions to so much more. So thank you for doing that, David, and giving us something to take away and think about. So this brings us to the end, and I apologize for not introducing you. That was the Honourable Professor David Chandler from Politics and International Relations. Thank you. So this brings us to the end of the symposium, and it's just time to say thank you, particularly to Beth and Christina, who were the prime movers and shakers in organising this symposium, assisted very much by John Cook, where is John? Who was, I think he's already left, unfortunately, who really curated the exhibition, and to Aisha Ford at the back, who's been our fantastic support in all the logistics of this event. So thank you very much for a wonderful time. Don't worry. And join us for a drink to finish this event. There's lots and lots of alcohol, I see, and very few of us. So let's get stuck in. And thank you for sticking around. Thanks.